Carolyn Dube here. Oh, what's the play for today? Well, today I'm playing around with something new to me called Powerwax. And this is from a company called Powertex. And this stuff was so much fun. And it was fun because it was forgiving. It was fun because it gave me an option to do things I couldn't do with just paint. And it played so well with some of my other supplies. And what I learned playing with this, I'm going to share with you in this video. There are actually 9 things that I learned about this that made me just fall in love with this stuff. Now, one of the big things to know about this is it is non-toxic and there are no VOCs. It's water-based, so that means cleanup is going to be a breeze. And cold wax, what does that mean? How does that work? Well, I'm going to share with you what I know as we get in and create this page. Before we dive into putting the Powerwax onto the art journal page, the first thing I'm going to do is just make a quick collage background. So why am I doing that? Why did I grab some page that had some random black spray ink cleanup from playing with stencils? And why am I gluing on a bunch of vintage receipts that will wonderfully let some of that pattern peek through? Well, I'm simply trying to create an area for me to explore the Powerwax on. Just an interesting background, a fertile kind of ground. And my goal here is simply to get this whole page covered. This isn't some grand plan of where to put things. It's really just about covering things up because this is the base layer and I'm going to be doing the Powerwax on top of it. I'm using gel medium here to attach all these papers with. And the reason why is because it's what I had within arm's reach. And that is often the very best glue to use. The other thing you may be wondering is why am I going over the top of it with gel medium? That is simply because that's how I'm smoothing the paper down to make sure it's nice and flat. I'm simply using that same tool, that spatula-like tool that I've got there, and I'm just using it to make sure it's down all the way. So in that process, there ends up being some gel medium added to the top of it. Now what I'm using here, this is just one option of what you can create a background with. You can use book text, you can use your kids' old homework, you can use magazines, anything that you've got. And if you've got an idea, a suggestion for something somebody could use to create a background like this, throw it in the comments. And that way, anyone watching this video who's looking for some more ideas of ways to start a background with some random papers like this can check it out for some ideas. Let's help each other out. One of the things about using vintage papers to do this is you never know what kind of ink was used on it. And that means sometimes things will smear. And if they do a little bit, I don't mind at all. This is a background after all. In this case, I got pretty lucky. Nothing smeared from the adding machine tape to the carbon copy receipts. Oh, and if you're not sure what a carbon copy receipt is, what I mean by that, go and ask someone that was alive before the age of all this technology, internet, and home printers, and they'll be able to explain to you why those were so handy. So I'm just going to finish up with all the little scraps here and cover up as much of the page as I can. And then I'm going to let it completely dry before I start the next step of bringing in the Powerwax. I've got a couple of different brands of paint here that I'm going to mix in with the Powerwax. This stuff is moist and it's creamy, but it's also kind of thick. The first thing that I learned about this is no ratio needed. I find that fantastic that you can just mix however much you want into the paint. So if you want to put a little Powerwax in it, you can, or if you want to put a whole bunch of Powerwax in it, you can. There's basically no wrong way to mix this stuff together. And there's no exact way to mix it. However you like to, put some paint in there with that Powerwax and blend them together. Here I'm using a palette knife, but you could use a paintbrush, a popsicle stick, whatever it is you've got, however you like to do it. And as the wax mixes with the paint, it takes on a different texture. It gets a lot thicker. And since I had that palette knife in my hand, I'm just going to try spreading some of it onto the art journal page. I've got some areas where it's going to be thicker. I've also got some areas where I'm going to put it on and then try and pull some of it off. I'm just going to scrape a bunch up so it leaves just a really light bit of color there behind. Now, a palette knife isn't my usual go-to for applying paint, so I kind of wondered how would this stuff work with a paintbrush? And it worked wonderfully. For me, I had a little more control over how much was there. I could do a little more blending, smoothing out areas with the paintbrush compared to the palette knife. And I'm not worried at all about cleaning up that paintbrush because it's water cleanup, both the acrylic paints, which are water-based, as well as the Powerwax. The second thing I learned was about altering the opacity of the mixture. So if you put just a little bit of paint in there, like what I'm doing here with the yellow, it's going to give you a more translucent look because there's just not as much color in it. And that's great if you want some of the background to peek through, if I want to let people see some of that receipt under that yellow. By doing a small amount of yellow into the power wax, I'm more likely to see what's underneath it. Usually when I think of wax, I think of things like beeswax or candle wax, and whenever it's room temperature, it's solid. And if you want it to be spreadable, you have to melt it. And that's what you do in encaustic art, is you're melting down wax to spread into your art. But here, because it's cold wax, I can put just a little on my finger and spread it around without any risk of being burnt. I've done a little bit of encaustic and I've enjoyed it every time that I've done it. But the reason why I don't do it very often is because of how much setup is involved. Because it does need to be well ventilated. You do need to be able to heat up the wax. And then I also have to worry about burning myself because I'm notorious for, if there's something hot around, I manage to get it on my flesh. And I think that's why I'm having so much fun with this power wax, is because I can start to do some of those things that you can do with wax without having to do any kind of big setup or worry about any kind of fumes. And I'm not going to burn myself since it's a cold wax. Now, when I mixed the yellow in with the power wax, I did a little bit of paint in there. And this time, when I'm doing the orange, I did a lot of paint in there. So that means this paint is going to be a little more opaque than the yellow. If I put a really thin layer of that orange on, I can still see things peeking through. But if I put what I consider a normal layer on, whatever's underneath is hidden. Number 3 of what I learned playing around with power wax is that it's forgiving. In so many ways, it is forgiving. Here, as I'm playing around with just scratching some marks into it, I had fun doing it. I liked how it felt, but I didn't like how the pattern itself looked. So all I'm going to do is simply brush some more power wax on there and put another pattern in there. Now, this is easy to do when everything's wet, but what about when it's dry? Is it forgiving when it's dry? Well, I'm going to be sharing about that a little bit later in this video. And yes, spoiler alert, it is extremely forgiving. Now for the next color that I'm going to do, I want to do that really, really neon bright pink there. And I'm just going to mix a little bit of it in with the power wax. And by only putting a small amount of paint in there, that's going to give me a very, very soft look to it. It's going to be very, very translucent. And that way I can just add a little hint of color as opposed to a really thick, fully covering opaque kind of color. And I'm simply going to grab the paint off of that palette knife with my paintbrush, and I'm going to start bringing it in to add in some color. Now the reason why that neon pink looks so soft on there is simply because there's a small amount of it in the power wax that allows you to just do very, very soft, light, very translucent layers. So now I'm going to add a little more of the paint in there just to do a comparison for you. So it's the same color, just added more paint in with the power wax. And now as I brush that on, see if you notice a little bit of a difference in the color and the intensity of it. Now the fourth thing that I learned with this was kind of one of those like, wow, why wasn't I expecting that? But this stuff feels like wax, that it's like there's a layer of wax on these things. And I love that extra tactile sensation. On this page, I happen to be doing the whole thing in power wax, so I'm playing around with it, but it can also be done just on a few elements, on just a few things. Now that pink is still creamy, so that makes it easy to buff out the edges with a dry paper towel. You can also thin it out, going over the top of it, buffing, pulling some of that power wax and paint off. But once it starts drying a little bit, it's not going to buff in quite the same way. So here with the teal, as I'm using more force, a little bit does come up onto the paper towel if I'm really working it, but it's not going to blend and smear quite so softly as it did with the pink, simply because with the pink, it was still creamy, and on the teal, it had started to dry. Now here with the green that I'm mixing with the power wax, I'm putting just a small amount of that green paint in there. I want just a really soft look to it. But it turns out I put a very small amount in there because when I brush it on, I can't even see the color. Well, that's an easy fix. All I'm going to do is just mix some more paint in with that power wax there. Because how much paint you mix in with it will determine what the color is. So if you ever mix it up and you feel like it's too light, simply add some more paint to it, like what I just did there with the green. And now when I paint it on there, now I can actually see that color. Now in this video, I'm condensing down about 2 hours of play for you. And so what we're gonna do, now that you've got an idea of how Powerwax works, the basics of it, now what I'm gonna do is skip to the high points. That way I can get as much important information for you here in this video as possible. Now what we're gonna be doing next involves stenciling and paint and Powerwax. Obviously, that's what we've been doing. And I've mixed some black with a little bit of Powerwax, but I've purposely put a small amount of paint in there because I want a very soft, a very translucent effect. I'm going to put the stencil on my page, and then I'm going to apply that paint and Powerwax with the brush. I'm just going to brush loosely right in there to pick up some of that pattern. And it's going to be a very imperfect pattern. And it just gives it that nice, subtle, quiet kind of look to it. It adds a layer, but it's not really jumping out at you. And I'm going to do the same over here. Small amount of black paint in with that Powerwax, so it creates a very, very soft impact to it. And I also didn't care if I could read the words or not. But for this one, I'm going to try it picking a specific word and doing it in a way that hopefully I can clearly read it. And so the hardest part for me is picking which word I want to use. Now, because I'm doing one word that I want to be able to read, I'm also going to play around with making it darker. So I'm just going to mix right there on the brush more black paint in with that Powerwax to darken it up because I want this one to stand out. And then I'm just brushing it right on top of it. But I have been living dangerously here. When you use a brush to apply paint this way, there's a chance it's going to run underneath, and it did on a couple of those letters there. Well, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to apply the paint using the palette knife. And this is the paint and Powerwax mixture, so it's nice and thick. I'm going to pick a word again, and then I'm going to go up top. Now, I was sitting on the fence whether I wanted to go with the word start or started. And I decided to go with started, but if I wanted to go with start, all I would have to do is just not put paint through the ED, so you can take the endings off of words really easily. And this one is definitely much crisper and clearer than continued. Now, I did think the word started would be a little bit darker than what it is, so that just tells me that I didn't have quite as much black paint mixed in there as I thought. Now, if I want to do words that I can easily read, those I would do a little more carefully. But for something like this with a pattern, you can easily get it on there with that paintbrush, and it goes very, very quickly. Both of these stencils are ones that I designed for over at stencilgirlproducts.com. And down below this video, I'll have links for you for all the supplies that I've used here. And this is the fifth thing that I learned playing with Powerwax, is that it plays well with other supplies that I have. So it works wonderfully with stencils, it works in art journaling, and it works with acrylic paint, because that's a big deal to me because other brands of cold wax, if they're oil-based, they require that you use oil paints with them, and I don't have a lot of those. But acrylic paints I've got plenty of, and Powerwax is water-based, so it plays with acrylics. The sixth thing that I learned with this stuff is about texture. This stuff is fantastic for creating marks and textures and things. So that orange Powertex that's on there, that was starting to dry, so it's not creamy anymore. So the teal that I'm putting on is just sitting right on top of it. And I'm putting on a generous layer of it with that palette knife, a nice thick layer so that it's covering up the orange underneath. And then I'm just going to start writing in it. Now, this could be shapes, it could be words, it could be anything you want. You can make marks in it. I'm using an old pencil, but a bamboo skewer, the end of the paintbrush, a toothpick, whatever you've got. Now, because Powerwax is so great at holding that texture, it's fantastic with stencils. So as I'm applying this Powerwax in yellow paint here, I'm putting a thick layer of it on. So when I lift up the stencil, it is going to leave some wonderful dimension in the pattern of this stencil. It's going to be so touchable once it's dry. Now, earlier I mentioned how forgiving Powerwax is. Here, I'm going to show you exactly how forgiving it is because I've just done some stenciling using my silly Silas and Sigmund stencil. Yeah, say that one 3 times quickly. And the other ones you can see there on the page, stenciled beautifully, no problem, nice and crisp the way I wanted. And this one, the one on the left, just didn't come out as crisply as what I wanted. If I'm feeling patient, I can try and just remove the little offending areas, but I decided I'm not feeling that patient. So I am simply just going to wipe that one completely off. But this is when the Powerwax is creamy. What about after it's had time to set up and it becomes firm? Can you do the same kind of thing? Well, a little bit later in the video, I'm going to show you just that. We're up to number 7 of the things that I learned playing around with this, and it has to do with blending and layering. You can brush on one color on top of the other, or with a palette knife, or apply it any way that you want. And when you're doing thin layers, the one beneath it peeks through, so you get some optical blending. But you can also do a little bit of buffing and blending. So I put some yellow there on the pink. Now I'm going to bring in a paper towel and just kind of buff and smooth that around, and you get a really, really subtle, beautiful blending of colors. You can also do this with white. I've mixed some white acrylic paint in here with the Powerwax to create almost of a whitewashing effect by just putting a really light, thin layer and then buffing it around with my fingertip. So back to the very forgiving nature of Powerwax. I've changed my mind on this guy and I don't want him here. But the wax had already set, it had firmed up. It was no longer creamy. And all that means is I can just scrape it off. I happen to be using some pointy metal tool that I have no idea what it's called or what it's from. It reminds me a lot of dental tools. But anything you've got that you can scrape or scratch with, you can pull up the wax. This also means that anywhere that you've got that wax that's set up that's firm, you can also scratch and scrape into it to put any design or pattern that you want in there. Now, this is probably not going to come as a big surprise to you, but if you've got a really thick layer of the Powerwax on there, you can do a lot more scratching, scraping into it, that kind of thing. It can be more noticeable. And if you've got a really thin layer of your paint and Powerwax mixture and you scratch into it, it's going to be a much more subtle look. Let me show you what I mean by that. So here in the stenciled squares that I've got, I'm just going to draw a little square inside the square very loosely. In person, the detail shows up a little bit better than on camera, but it's just one of those little kinds of details that you can add into the Powerwax that just adds to the layers and the interest of your art journal page. One of the perks of all that wonderful texture, especially stenciled texture, is that if you take a Powerwax and paint mixture, like what we've been using throughout this whole page, and put it on top, you can buff it around it, and the edges grab the color a little differently than the top. And because this is Powerwax, it makes it easy to adjust how much is there. So I've blended it around with my finger a little bit here, and it's a little bit more than what I want. So all that takes then is a paper towel, just a dry paper towel to buff off some of that and blend the edges to get a little bit softer look. I confess, I didn't fully believe the jar when it said it was water cleanup. How does something that's wax clean up with water? Well, it's a water-soluble wax, which my brain still isn't fully wrapped around that idea, but this did easily clean up with water. The brushes came clean, no problem. And the same was true for the stencils. When I put them in water, the Powerwax easily came off of it. That would be the teal color that's coming off there. The blue and the black, that was dried acrylic paint from long ago. I did get the stencils into the water while the Powerwax was still a little bit creamy, which means I hadn't let it completely dry and set up on the stencils. Now here's another cleanup confession for you. I will throw them into the water pretty quickly after I'm done playing, but I don't necessarily actually clean them right away. I'll let them soak in the water for a while and let the water do all the hard work. So after they've been in there a bit, then all I have to do is rinse them off and then they're good to go. Now, the 9th thing that I learned had to do with will the pages stick together. So I did a little experiment to find out. I painted these cardboard pieces with acrylic paint, and on these two, I'd put Powerwax, a thin layer on each one of them, and I stuck them together and put a book on top. Well, those did not stick together at all. They came right apart. But what about the ones that had just acrylic paint on them? And here I am trying to pull them apart. They stuck together quite a bit. It took a fair amount of force to pull these things apart. Now, both sets of these cardboard pieces were on the shelf for the same amount of time, and they were both under the same book. So the ones with the Powerwax on them did not stick at all. So that gives me a clue about how this is going to behave in my art journal. Now, one last bit of cleanup here. The wax is all firmed up, so none of it's creamy still. And some of it'll just peel right up. And I'm using a gel plate as my palette. And I could absolutely peel it off bit by bit like this, or I can take a little bit of a faster approach of how to get everything off of the gel plate. So first thing I'm going to do is pull up any big, thick areas. and then I'm going to add a layer of white paint onto it. Now I chose to use a gel plate as my palette as personal preference. I love to use them for paint palettes. You can use anything that you like when you're doing Power Wax. You can use this as a paint palette or anything else that you've got, a piece of wax paper, a paper plate, whatever you like to do. There are no rules with this. Use what you've got on hand. Now the tip that I've got there on the white paint, it's by Amsterdam and it is designed for their paint tubes. It's something that I buy in addition to the paint, and that way I can just put a nozzle on it instead of having the big cap. And that allows me to control how much paint is coming out. So if you're interested in those, again, I'll have everything linked for you down below. Now, once I've got the paper on there, I waited about 5 minutes to let things dry. Then it's just a matter of lifting up that paper and pulling the vast majority of everything up. Those little bits that are on there, I love to leave a little grunge on the plate, so I'm just going to leave them be. But this is the fast way that I clean my plate. Thanks so much for joining me for today's play. I hope you've had as much fun as I have playing around here. And if you'd like to see more of what I'm up to, hit that subscribe button. That way you'll know as soon as I've got a new video out. And if you would like weekly encouragement, if you would like some free downloads, that's all waiting for you on my newsletter. And I'll have the link down below where you can get signed up at acolorfuljourney.com. Thanks so much for letting me be a part of your colorful journey.